Welcome back. You're still watching the SABC's Prime News, and we continue to unpack the political developments that are unfolding in Zimbabwe. And we're now joined on the line by Professor Martin Rupiya from UNISA's African Renaissance Studies. He's also retired Zimbabwean Lieutenant Colonel. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Professor Rupiya. So,
thanks for inviting us.
Oh, it's only a pleasure. So, you know, the military, this isn't the first time. In many ways, they've always been part of the political scene in Zimbabwe, albeit perhaps in the past not so visibly so.
Not necessarily, Peter. We published a book in 2015, which we called The Veto Power of the Military in Zimbabwe on the question of political succession. The scenarios we developed then did not foresee almost the decapitation of the leader, removing the president and then creating another replacement faction, as it has turned out. It has always been that they have been drawn into politics, but certainly as a repressive tool towards the political opposition. But what has now happened is that that pillar, which has sustained the presidency and the ruling party, has now become disconnected.
All right. So, but, you know, people suggest that the army in particular has been the enforcers of the political powers in play over the 37 years.
Yeah, certainly that is true. From about 2000, we have clearly a move by the popular mass away from the ruling party. And the alternative for the ruling party, certainly for those in South Africa, they can read, Sisi Kampempe's report sent in by President Thabo Mbeki in the presidential election of 2002, March. You can begin to see from that time that the leadership in power did not depend or did not master sufficient political, support. And simply they then replaced that by drawing the military into politics and militarizing the Zimbabwean politics, at the same time.
All right, so you spent a good number of years in Zimbabwe's National Army as a ranking officer. Tell us what you can about the characters that have come forward now. Let's start with General Chiwenga. Who is he, and does the army follow him totally?
Very interesting. Of course, I retired in 1989, but clearly, and I've worked with his, colleagues, and interesting, Peter, is that General Moyo, who made the announcement on television, was a cadet officer whom I supervised, to get his rankings. So yes, I've worked with the colleagues, but I think the environment has changed. Certainly during our time, there was an attempt to integrate the armies that, were in place at the independence, but also to create a sense of apolitical or maybe professionalism. And I think the balance under General Mujulu, the late, was partly achieved at the time, although, with different units being pulled and doing certain things and, coming back in. And here I'm referring to the 5th Brigade, for example, pulled to do the work in Matabeleland, which has not been publicly acknowledged. But certainly this was, during our time. Not the rest of the army did that. But in the last 10, 15 years, certainly after 2000, there's been a deliberate, as it were, opening to get the military to become part of the ruling party. And so going forward, that process still has to be revisited so that we begin to move away from supporting a political party or a particular individual, but to begin to create a national character.
So after the 2008 elections, I think this came to the fore, people suggesting that President Mugabe probably had fled the country and decided to leave, but that these army generals decided that that wasn't going to be the case and almost forced the government of national unity in the end.
2008 was a very interesting one because the evidence now beginning to emerge is that President Mugabe lost the election. But the parties were so polarized and divided that the military felt uncomfortable to welcome, a new leader, the MDC, etc. And so after 4 days, they set the president down apparently and said, "You're going nowhere. We're going to have to go through another runoff in 6 weeks." And the violence which has been documented then ensued. And in fact, at the end of that 6 weeks, as we have also seen in Kenya, it was a one-man show. The president ran, on himself, and the opposition boycotted that very violent runoff. But it has been typical in that I think the military has been trying to rehabilitate itself and become part of, supporting the national and also the ordinary people in Zimbabwe. So partly what has happened is drawing some support from people that wanted something to change.
All right. Anecdotally, I drove from Masvingo to Harare with a senior police officer, and he was quite young. And I had a long chat with him, and I got a sense that there's a layer of the police and police officers that are not really happy with their leadership. And I wonder if the situation is the same with the army, where you have this old school, this old class that's been running things since day one, but below them, they follow orders, but perhaps not necessarily tremendously loyal, so that if the dynamics change, who knows what might happen?
For now, what we see is also quite worrying. And we've seen this in Lesotho, for example, where units begin to fight one another. And there's evidence, on WhatsApp and pictures emerging of police, being arrested. And there's also unconfirmed reports that the police commissioner himself has also been arrested. So what that tells us is that there is division between the armed forces, the security and the defense. The police certainly appear, or the leadership appear not to have gone along, with the rest, because you can see what has happened has long been in plan. This is not an overnight case of people waking up and surrounding and decapitating the president, seizing government buildings, including the television station where you used to work, ZBC. But so the plans may have been shielded away from the police leadership. But I agree with you, in both the armed forces and the police, there is a layer that cannot be dispensed with. People that can be trained, that can be professionalized, that have a sense of commitment, going forward. So you don't have to throw the baby with the bathwater, as it were.
All right. Perhaps finally, looking forward, I think of Egypt and the role that the military has played there, and it's never quite disappeared. Once the Zimbabwean army gets a taste of genuine power, will it be easy for them to retreat to the barracks?
You're so right. Egyptian military has been part of the political scene since 1952. And more recently, when Mohamed Morsi was elected into office, the military under Assisi simply, jailed him. So in Egypt, as we speak, we have a divided nation right, straight down the middle. And I fear that Zimbabwe in future may go that route. So we have work to do, many of us, in academia and elsewhere, to try and reconcile the, factions and the parties and the society, because I think you're partly right. If we don't do serious work towards bringing, parties together, then what we have seen in terms of the military use political solutions will become a feature that, will characterize Zimbabwe's destiny as we go forward.
Professor Martin Rupiya, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time and your insights. That was Professor Martin Rupiya, who himself, Francis, is a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel, 19 years in the Army there, and he retired in 1989.
That was some good insight.
Yeah.
And let's take a look at some pictures now circulating from locals in Zimbabwe on Twitter today. So we are reflecting social media here. Tanks were spotted in the streets again in various areas, but it's believed that there were some checkpoints, locals simply walking by as if the situation was a normal sighting.
Yeah, the newly changed Robert Mugabe International Airport sign was even vandalized to block its name out, whilst others continue to show their support for the long-reigning president.